Judea Black, Shalom L'Chaim, purified drinking water. They got it. It's out there. Got to move this thing along. Like I said, we've been giving a lot of information, and I'm getting to a point, so I got to keep pushing. I got to keep moving this. This next video right here is the origins of the Israelites. Okay, origins of the Israelites. That's what it is. Judea Black, Shalom L'Chaim, purified drinking water. They got it. It's out there. Shouts out to the soldiers. I support the women of the cause. My 200 down. My 9 stragglers. You know, my pass-alongs. Take your incident and pass it along. Cue that music.
It doesn't seem right that I was born white and my parents don't fight. They just told me they love me each night as I don't lose sleep for
is ancient Israel and the Israelites. Dr. Aaron Mayer, thank you so much for coming on today.
It's my pleasure, like always.
So I'd like to start off by asking a very basic question, and that is, who were the ancient Israelites?
Well, that's the $63,000 question, as they say. We'll start like this. The ancient Israelites were a group that was eventually identified both by themselves and by others, but to a large extent based on the traditions that come through in the biblical texts and the biblical traditions. Now, we do have sources that talk about the ancient Israelites or groups like the ancient Israelites from the very end of the late Bronze Age and onwards, and not enough and too far, too few and far between. But they do enable us to sort of build a picture of who they are, where they came from, how they developed, etc. So, for example, the earliest non-biblical source which mentions the Israelites is an inscription of the Egyptian pharaoh Mer-Nekhtar around 1200 or slightly before 1200 BCE, in a description of his activities, mainly military activities in Canaan. That's more or less modern Israel, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon of today. Fought battles against various peoples, towns, and one of the peoples that he mentions are the Israelites, and he claims that he destroyed them. Now, that's the first mention, and then the name Israel is not mentioned in an extra biblical source for several hundred years later, till the 9th century BCE, in what we call the Iron 2A. That would be parallel to the biblical chronology after the time of David and Solomon. This is after the separation of the Israelite kingdom and the Judahite kingdom to 2 kingdoms. And there, they're mentioned, the Israelites are mentioned in 3 or 4 sources as the king of Israel, something of the sort. So we know that at 1200, let's say in 10 BCE, the Egyptians knew of a group that was somewhere in Canaan, Palestine, land of Israel, whatever you want to call it, that they called that group Israelite. We don't know, based on that source, very much, just that there was a group with the name Israel out there. Now, in parallel to this, you have all the biblical traditions, which give us a narrative of a very long development of the background and development of the peoples and the groups that eventually became the Israelites, and the tradition of the fathers of the Israelites, and the sojourn in Egypt, and then the Exodus and the conquest of the land of Israel, etc. Now, of course, the big question is, and again, if there are people here who feel very strongly about the biblical text, you'll excuse me if I offend anybody, but as an archaeologist, as a historian, as a scientist, we have to always question our sources. And the big question is, of course, what of the narrative that we receive in the biblical text is historical in the modern sense of history, that it actually describes events that occurred one by one at the time. And on the other hand, what parts of the biblical text are ideologically oriented to try to tell a story from certain point of view, from an ideological point of view, spoken much later than the events that supposedly happened. So then when we have the depiction, for example, in the biblical text of the Exodus or the conquest of the land by Joshua or David and Solomon, and actually any event described in the Bible, it's not that we say we assume it's not correct, but we say we have to use critical evidence of trying to find other sources that corroborate, whether it's other historical sources, archaeological evidence that tell us that these events, depictions here, actually occurred in some way or another. So that's the problem when dealing with the Israelites. When we look for external sources depicting, telling us about Israelites, we have very few. So back to the question of who are the Israelites, they are eventually peoples who settled down and somewhere in the 10th or 9th century, kingdoms were formed in what we would call now the Central Hills of Israel, or the West Bank in some jargon. And there you had the Judite kingdom in the south and the Israelite kingdom in the north. And these people had two kingdoms, which are probably the people that we would call Israelites lived. Although the kingdom of Israel is probably the original Israelites. The kingdom of Judah were the Judites. And once the kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians in 722, then apparently the kingdom of Judah took upon it the name Israelites. And that's why nowadays when we talk about Israelite history, for example, in the Iron Age, we're often talking about really Israelite history and Judite history, which we've put together in the same basket. Now, the Israelites, if we want to call them that, we don't know for sure exactly their components. And was Israel the only main component or the other components? And we'll talk about later the various theories of how the Israelites appeared, whether from outside, from inside, all kinds of different views on this. What we do know that after the Iron Age, after the destruction of the Israelite kingdom, and then in 586 the destruction of the Judite kingdom and the temple in Jerusalem, the traditions relating to the Israelites during the Iron Age continue in various manners. Now, to a certain extent, that's where Jewish traditions coming from the Bible and other sources develop. And by the way, we have another group very closely related to the Jews, the Samaritans, who see themselves as being continuation of the Israelites also. So and from there the historical ball rolls along and things develop, and all kinds of different narratives connected to it.
Now, let's talk etymological histories and origin. Where does the term Israelite come from?
Well, that's a very problematic question. There are various suggestions. What does Israel mean? One of the possibilities is it's the name is El, is one of the main Semitic gods, so that perhaps part of it. There have been various suggestions of implying that they came from somewhere in Arabia or somewhere in to the north of Israel, but that's very unclear. The bottom line is you have a group who's mentioned by Merneptah, and it's Israel. And by the way, the Egyptians at that time didn't have a what we would call an L. So anything that was with an L, they turned into an R. So it's actually written Israel, something like that. And we see that in many languages. For example, if you think of between Japanese and English, the problem of the L and R. So at that time, but it's probably Israel, and that indicates, again, we don't know what the group was exactly, where they were exactly, but they were somewhere in Canaan, modern Israel, more or less. And the Egyptians considered them a people because, along with the name Israel, they had the Egyptian sign for an ethnic group. So it was considered by the Egyptians some sort of a group.
That's very interesting. I didn't realize that about the Egyptian and the R. So that's really interesting. It's kind of like reminds me how there's no soft C in Latin. So in reality, everything's with a hard K, kind of like, or if you want to say Julius Caesar, or I'm not too fond of saying Tacitus. That just ruins it for me. So I'll say Tacitus. I feel like that's what everybody's familiar with.
Well, by the way, the story goes that in World War II, the American codes in the Pacific Theater, they purposely put in many words with L in it because it would be harder for a native Japanese speaker to fake them. So, I mean, that occurs in many interactions between languages. Now, by the way, there has been a suggestion that another Egyptian inscription mentions Israel from about 80 years before the Maranatha inscription, from the time of Ramses II. This was suggested by a couple of scholars, but overall, it's not accepted by most. Most scholars read this inscription differently. But even if we should say that there is another inscription mentioning Israel around not 1210, but say 1280 BC, all it means is that that group, later to be known as Israel by the Egyptians and others, had a longer process of formation in this region. It doesn't tell us much more, because one of the issues that why there is some ideology behind this is that if you go according to the biblical narrative, so the Israelites should be enslaved in Egypt until the Exodus, and then they wander in the desert for 40 years. And then after the death of Moses, Joshua takes them in and captures the land. Now, very often, the time of the appearance of the Israelites, based on the Maranatha and based on archaeology, is placed around 1200. And then archaeologists and historians say, hey guys, when we look at the land of Israel and the archaeological remains from Canaan at the transition between late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, we don't have evidence of a massive conquest of the land. We have some sites were destroyed, but it's a drawn-out process, and there's no, uniform military campaign in which these sites are destroyed. And going back, we don't have any clear evidence of the sojourn in the desert. We don't have clear evidence of the Exodus, etc. So some scholars will say, it's not in 1200. Let's put it back to 1400. Let's put it back to 1600. For example, some have suggested that it's connected to the Egyptians defeating the Hyksos at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and they say, so the Hyksos are actually the Israelites who were kicked out of Egypt, and it connects to a tradition that appears in Josephus, etc. But it's all, so some of the people are trying to say, we have an earlier reference to Israel. It says, they're already around at that time. But that's a marginal opinion. I'm sure the people believe that don't think it's marginal, but I think when you look at most scholarship, it's marginal. And when we're talking about the appearance of Israel, it occurs sometime before 1200 BCE. That's when we have the first concrete evidence. Now, what can we say beyond that? It's really hard to go on that. And that connects to the big question of who are the Israelites? Where they come from? Are they coming from outside? Are they coming from inside Canaan? And all that complex issue.
And so we've talked a little bit about the ancient Israelites, and I was hoping that you could expand on some of the theories as to where that they came from.
According to the biblical narrative, the Israelites come from Egypt, go through the desert for 40 years, come around through the Sinai, around the bottom, come out in modern-day Jordan, and then enter into the land at Jericho. And then the miraculous conquest of Jericho and the conquest of the various parts of the land, as depicted both in the book of Joshua and to a certain extent in the book of Judges. Now, from a very early stage of the modern research of both the biblical texts, but more so the archaeological remains in the land, it became apparent that it's almost impossible to find evidence of a uniform conquest of the land around 1200. That we don't see anything, and in fact, iconic sites such as Jericho and a couple of other sites don't even have the remains from the end of the Late Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. So they're even places which are at the center of the narrative, things are missing. So for 60, 70 years already, there's been a discussion in scholarship about how to understand the Israelites appearing. Now, one opinion, which was professed, for example, by the late American biblical archaeologist Albright, or the Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadim, said that, yes, we nevertheless can find a few of the major sites which were destroyed at the time, and we should talk about a military conquest. On the other hand, there were scholars, and I would say to a certain extent, this was for many years the dominant opinion, is that the Israelites did come from outside, but it was a slow and, let's say, a peaceful process in which they slowly infiltrated into the land, into the peripheral regions, and then with time became stronger and stronger, and that's when they took over these regions and other regions. Then an additional understanding developed, which has various, I would say, nuances in it, is that the Israelites, to a larger extent, were local people, that they didn't come from outside, but most of them, or all of them, were actually people who had lived in the land beforehand, and for various reasons, changed their identity, changed the way that they lived, and developed a new identity. And some people said, for example, these were urban Canaanites who didn't like the social order in late Bronze Age Canaan and escaped from the cities and developed their own identity. This is not accepted by most. Others say that these were lowland peoples who escaped into the highlands, and others say that it's basically in the highlands where the Israelites developed. Over the periods, there's been a cycle of moving from nomadic, semi-nomadic subsistence to more settled rural and sometimes urban subsistence. And so this was a cycle, and one of the cycles we see is at the transition between the Late Bronze and the Iron Age when the Israelites appear. So, and why do they say this? Because one, we don't have evidence of many of the sites being destroyed. And a no less important aspect is that when you look at the material culture of the early Israelites, a lot of it is very, very similar to that of the Canaanites. That you do have here and there things that may indicate non-local aspects, but by and large, most of the early Israelite culture and religious and cultic objects and writing and names and gods, etc., can be seen to be coming out of the Canaanite mediae. So it's hard to say that they came from somewhere outside in the desert and brought something new. Now, most probably, if I would assess the current status, the idea that most of the Israelites are in fact from within Canaan is probably fits the evidence, I would say in the fullest manner. That said, it could be that portions of the Israelites also came from outside the Canaan, from for example, from Transjordan or from Syria or maybe some from Egypt, because there's a very strong tradition in the biblical text of peoples coming from Egypt, peoples coming from Syria, from Aram, as peoples coming from Transjordan, and it doesn't mean that it's accurate, but perhaps there's something in these memories. And then again, the people of Israel were not just those people who were called Israel by the Egyptians, by Merenatach, but it might have been that was the name of a dominant family dominant clan, with which time, perhaps due to a charismatic leader or something of the sort, they gathered the other groups and clans together with the various traditions. Oh, yes, I came from Egypt, you came from Aram, I was local, etc., and all this intermingled into this entity, which one of its forms was being called Israel.
And for example, when you talk about them coming from possible outside sources, that reminds me about Abraham and the possibility of him being from Ur. Would you expand a little bit on that?
That's a very good example of, if Abraham's from Ur of the Chaldees. Ur is a very important southern Mesopotamian city. The Chaldees, though, the Chaldeans appear much, much later in history. So again, there is a very strong tradition of the three fathers of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, coming from outside of Israel, coming from the Mesopotamian or the Syrian or the Aramean sphere. But of course, the big question is the historical order of first the patriarchs, the three fathers, then the sojourn in Egypt and the Exodus and the conquest of the land, is that the real historical order? Or perhaps is the traditions of the patriarchs something that was inserted into the biblical narratives at another stage and turned into a historical process, which might be all mixed together? That's of course that's the basic problem with reading the biblical text. Do we accept the historical process and development and chain as written in the biblical text as a given? And for example, some scholars will say the patriarchs, they weren't in the Middle Bronze Age or the Late Bronze Age, before the Egypt. They were actually at the time. Some will say they're at the time of the Iron One, the beginning, the Israelite appearance in Canaan. Some people say no, they're much later. They're post-Iron Age, even some people will claim. So I mean, it's a very big question of who these people are, what the traditions, and that's part of the issue, is that the biblical texts, by and large, represent this combination, this entanglement of traditions coming from different groups, different peoples, and different periods, which are then put together into this thing. Now, I like relating to the biblical text. It's like it's a multi-layered archaeological tale. So when you look at the biblical text, first of all, there are various components that were made at different times, but it's just like an archaeological tale. Sometimes you can have intrusive materials that go from a higher level down, or sometimes a little rascal mole brings something from a lower level up, and you can have a very big mix-up here. So in an ancient source as the biblical text, which has gone through this enormous process of composition and editing, we can't, from a scientific point of view, assume that this is the picture that we have. Now, from a religious point of view, if you want to read the biblical text and relate to its, it's the religious messages coming from, that's fine. But if you want to relate to it as a source from which you try to build the history, as in the modern sense of this region at the time, we have to use it very critically and sometimes take it apart and put it together again.
To really give a insight into the ancient Israelites, I was hoping for people who may not be as familiar with the subject, would you expand and hit us with the tribal names of the ancient Israelites? Well,
according to the biblical text, there are 12 tribes. And these tribes are, in the biblical narrative, appear throughout the history of the Israelites from the time of Jacob, the forefather, because the 12 tribes are named after his sons and two of his grandsons, and they play a role in the Exodus, they play a role in the conquest, and they play a role in the depiction of the period before the monarchy in the biblical text of the judges, where one of the judges comes from each of the 12 tribes. The big question is, though, are those tribes historical? Was there really a Reuven, a Levi, a Shimon, a Judah, et cetera, or were these tribe names based on some later concept of who comprised the Israelites, Maybe some of them are real. Maybe some of them are imagined. Maybe they were in different forms, etc. And scholarship is very, very, confused about this, and there are various opinions on it, whether the tribes do represent the actual format of the early Israelite society. And for example, there was a scholar, a famous German scholar, Nott, who tried to suggest that there was a tribal league similar in Israel, similar to the tribal leagues we know of in ancient Greece, or was this something that formed later, or all the way to opinions that it's a complete fabrication of a later period. Now, whatever the case, in my opinion, the fact that there is a tradition that the early Israelite society was comprised of tribes tells us of the complexity and multi-level layers of the Israelite society, not only before the monarchies, but also during the monarchies, because we have a when we look at ancient history, I'm sure you're familiar with this from other contexts, it's very easy and very convenient to look things at very simplistic, straightforward, black and white pictures. Is that there was a king sitting in the kingdom, and he controlled everything, and he sent out his messenger to the end of the kingdom, and everything did exactly what he said. It doesn't happen today, didn't happen then. And ancient kingdoms were what we call patronage systems. That means that you had a leader who was slightly more charismatic, who, due to all kinds of coalition politics, managed to get various local leaders to be loyal to him, and he had to give them, and they had to give them, and there was a back and forth. And every once in a while, someone was not satisfied, so he changed loyalty to another king, and back and forth. So it means that ancient Israel society was comprised of clans and families and tribes and regional leaders who lived in various parts of the land. And at various stages, they were affiliated with the king who was in Jerusalem, the king who was in Samaria. And even the biblical tradition about the kings in Israel, the capital moves around from various places. There's various dynasties who are the kings of Israel throughout the history of the kingdom of Israel. So it's a very complex and messy process that's going on. So I think Israelite society was messy, just like modern traditional Middle Eastern society is messy. And listen, we're still suffering today in the Middle East from the fact that in the 1920s, a French and a British diplomats by the name of Sykes and Picot drew the borders of the countries based on their concepts of nationality, without taking into account not tribes and not religions, etc. And until today, the place is in mayhem because of that. Look at any country you talk about. I mean, in the Middle East. I mean, not only in Israel and Palestine. Think of Iraq. Think of Syria. What's going on? Think of Lebanon. The enormous problems that occurred because of various groups, ethnicities, tribes, religions that are all living together in this very complex situation. And these things existed throughout time. So I think the traditions of the 12 tribes. It doesn't matter whether they are exactly historical or the names did exist, and we don't have evidence of all the names, but it tells us of the makeup of Israelite society.
And so Brian Anderson had asked a really interesting question, and my fans love the topic of ancient DNA. And so my question from Brian Anderson is, has modern DNA studies told us anything about these ancient Israelites?
Okay, that's a great study, a great question, and it is also a question with a lot of, a lot of minefields in it, because ancient DNA is a revolution in the study of the ancient world, no question about it, and it will tell us a lot about the biological relatedness of various groups. And not only related to the Israelites, it related to, people in Australia, whatever, That said, all too often, it's used as sort of like the new magical silver bullet to explain antiquity. And one of the things that we know today is that culture is not necessarily dictated by genes. And you can be related to some people genetically who you're very close culturally, but you can also be very not related culturally, and you find your identity as far as your DNA goes. So you have to be very, very careful in the various interpretations of saying, well, you'll excuse me, and I hope I don't offend any of these companies, all these companies that do genetic things, and then they say you're 7% Irish and 14% Welsh, and there's a Spanish component. It sounds to me like a lot of crap, if you'll excuse my French, because although there are typical haplotypes of the various groups in the various areas, but you go to any country today, in any region today, they'll have this mixture of people who, from the same genetic background with different beliefs, not only political, religious, and identity, etc. You go to any Thanksgiving dinner in the United States today, and you hear the arguments over politics. So they're all genetic related. So that same. Now, with that said, the DNA evidence that we do have from modern Jews, let's say various Jewish communities throughout the world, show that there is a lot of commonality, genetic commonality between Jews, and that there does seem to be a connection and a similarity with DNA that is typical of the area of the Levant. That said, probably the people who are most similar are the Israelites, the modern Israelis, and the modern Palestinians. So, there you go. So what does that mean? It means that they had a lot of common ancestors, and it could be some of the Palestinians were originally Jews who converted to Christianity and then to Islam, etc., and all kinds of things like that. But at the end of the day, the two groups which see themselves as opposing themselves politically, from every way you look at it, are genetically very closely related. So there's always a problem there. What does the DNA tell you? And really, at the end of the day, it tells you biological relatedness. Then we have to take on all kinds of other aspects, history, archaeological evidence, et cetera, that we can build a picture of who the various groups are. But I would say that the DNA evidence that we do have show quite clearly that most of the Jews that we know throughout the world are biologically related, and they seem to source, for the most part, from this region. Of course, over the centuries, Jews who lived in all kinds of places, there was intermarriage between various groups. So you do have various elements coming in. But for example, there's this theory about that the Jews are all Ashkenazi Jews are all Khazars who were converted to Judaism and then moved to Eastern Europe. So genetically, that's shown to be totally baseless, just as most historians think it's totally baseless. So I would say that the DNA gives us a picture which doesn't contradict the general narrative of understanding of who the Jews were, both how Jewish communities today developed and how Jewish communities in the past developed. And so that's what I would say the most important thing about DNA now.
One thing you had brought up in our series on the Philistine was their diet and how the study of those diets can really tell us a lot about who these people were and shed more light on them. And I was hoping you could do the same for the ancient Israelites as well.
Okay. Well, one of the I would say the clearest cultural aspects of Judaism for many centuries was the very unique Jewish diet, or the taboos, what they could eat, what they couldn't eat. You couldn't eat pig. You had to slaughter animals in a certain way. You don't mix meat and milk, and all kinds of things like that. The question, of course, when were these tradition forms, and when did they? Can we trace them back archaeologically? Because we know historically, already Greek authors talk about Jewish dietary preferences. And this is something that's mentioned in the biblical text. So the question is, can we talk about these dietary preferences and taboos already way back with the early Israelites? Now, for many, many years, it was thought that we have a very nice example here regarding pig consumption, because in many sites identified as Israelite, there was little or no pig. And sites, for example, of the Philistines, we had pig. So it was said, you want to differentiate what side is Philistine, what side is Israelite. If I have pig, it's Philistine. If you don't have pig, it's Israelite. What's the problem? It became a little more complicated. First of all, it turns out that during the early Iron Age, the Canaanites also didn't eat pig. And then even more complex than that, it turns out that at some sites that we consider Israelite, particularly in the northern Israelite kingdom, there is consumption of pig, while at southern Judite sites, there's much less consumption of pig. That said, an article is about to appear in which, in the excavations of the city of David in the late Iron Age, which with no doubt is Judite, they found a little piglet in a house. So what I'm trying to say is that even the supposedly clear-cut differentiation between pig and no pig, Jew, non-Jew, or Israelite, non-Israelite, is a little iffy. Now, another example is, according to Jewish tradition, what we call kashrut, the Jewish dietary traditions, nowadays there are certain types of fish that you can eat and you can't eat. And it's usually if they have gills or scales. Now, catfish is not considered kosher today. But you find in Iron Age Jerusalem, Judite Jerusalem, catfish imported from Egypt. So it means, for example, as far as catfish, somebody was not doing it. And the same thing, for example, can we show evidence of separation between milk and meat? Right now, we don't know, but archaeology is starting to have the tools which may give us an ability to say this, because, for example, now in archaeology, both organic residue analysis of the contents of vessels and proteomics, which is we can identify proteins of various foods, that may in the future give us some insight, some window into perhaps can we talk about when the tradition of the later Jewish tradition of separating milk and meat, can we find where it first appears archaeologically? Is it something in the Iron Age, or is it something, in the Hellenistic Roman period? Because by then we know for sure. But the question is, could we place it, archaeologically? But that's, again, still up in the air, and hopefully sometime in the future we might be able to have more insights on that.
I've seen a lot of references between people discussing ancient Israel online, and one gentleman had pointed out that he thought the term Hebrew and Israelite were not the same thing, and I was curious about that. And in your opinion, what are your thoughts on that? Can you use one term to describe the other, or no?
Well, there are various terms that are used in various ancient sources to describe. So you have the Israelites, and you also and sometimes let's say the Israelites or cognate groups are called the Hebrews. Now, it's not clear exactly what they indicate, and again, because it could be that they're the various groups that develop differently and over time. Now, one of the things that has to be shot down immediately is for many, many years, and still you hear it today, it was popular to say that the Hebrews, the etymological basis of Hebrew is the Habiru. The sort of the semi-nomadic or groups that are mentioned in Egyptian sources and other and Mesopotamian sources, which were sort of like marginal in society. So it was said that Hebrews are Habirus. Now, what probably is Habirus is a social class. Some of the people who were called Hebrews, Ivrim in Hebrew, may have been Habirus also, but it doesn't mean that every Habiru is Hebrew, and every Hebrew came from the Habiru. They're used in various terms, and for example, very often in the context of the patriarchs, the mention of the Hebrews. And again, what does this tell us about the original use? What was added in later? What's an ideological understanding of later, etc. And that just shows again the complexity of who these groups were that formed into what later became the Israelite kingdom and the Judite kingdom.